There are moments in life when betrayal doesn't arrive with a whisper. It comes with a roar in front of everyone you've ever known, stripping away everything you thought was sacred. For Geneva Wright, that moment came on a Thursday evening at the Bethel Community Center, where the fundraiser she'd helped organize became the stage for her public execution. The punch bowl had been knocked over, whether by accident or design, no one would say, and Geneva stood there in her Sunday best, now soaking wet, the fabric of her dress torn at the shoulder where someone had grabbed her. In her trembling hand, she clutched a crumpled eviction notice, the words blurring through the moisture. But it wasn't the water or the ruined dress that made her shake. It was the voice of her cousin Shanice, amplified by righteous indignation and the perfect acoustics of betrayal, telling everyone within earshot that Geneva Wright was a thief. The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Shanice's voice carried across the room with practiced precision, each syllable landing like a hammer blow. She told them all how Geneva had stolen their grandmother's precious ruby brooch, the family heirloom that had been passed down for 3 generations. She told them how Geneva had embezzled from Celeste's table, the catering business their grandmother had built from nothing, draining accounts and forging checks while Grandma Celeste lay dying in a hospital bed. She told them that Geneva, with her fancy teaching job and her college education, had always thought she was better than her own family, and now the proof was undeniable. The crowd gasped and murmured, a wave of shock rippling through the assembled community. These were people Geneva had known her entire life, people she'd served Sunday dinners to, people whose children she'd taught, people who'd celebrated at Grandma Celeste's table for decades. And now they looked at her like she was a stranger, like she was something diseased. Geneva tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but her voice was swallowed by the noise. She looked around desperately for a friendly face, for someone who might step forward and say this was madness, that Geneva Wright would never steal from anyone, least of all from the grandmother who'd raised her. But the faces she saw were closed, skeptical, already convinced. And then she saw the brooch, the ruby brooch Shanice claimed had been stolen, pinned proudly to Shanice's own dress, catching the fluorescent light like a drop of blood. Standing beside Shanice was Deacon Morris, a man Geneva had known since childhood, a pillar of the church community, someone Grandma Celeste had trusted with everything. He stood there in his crisp suit, his face grave and sorrowful, saying nothing. His silence was its own kind of testimony. When Geneva locked eyes with him, when she whispered across the space between them, "You know the truth," he simply looked away. That's when Geneva knew this wasn't just betrayal. It was a plan, and she was already buried. To understand how Geneva Wright ended up standing in that community center with her life in ruins, you have to go back. You have to go back to the shotgun house near Mount Zion Baptist Church, where the paint was always peeling, but the garden was always blooming. You have to go back to Grandma Celeste, who raised Geneva after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. Celeste Wright was a force of nature wrapped in an apron, a woman who could stretch a chicken into 3 meals and make you feel like you'd eaten like royalty at everyone. Celeste's table started in that tiny kitchen, with Celeste cooking for church functions and neighborhood gatherings. Word spread the way it does in communities where good food is a love language, and before long, Celeste had scraped together enough to rent a small storefront. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. She served soul food that fed the body and the spirit, collard greens that melted in your mouth, macaroni and cheese that made grown men cry, peach cobbler that people drove across town for. The neighborhood called it their living room, their celebration hall, their refuge. Geneva grew up in that business, learning to cook at her grandmother's elbow, learning to serve with grace, learning to keep books and manage orders. Even when she went to college on a scholarship, the first in her family to go, she came home every weekend to help. After she became a teacher, working long hours at Lincoln Elementary, she still sent money home every month. Not because Grandma asked, but because Geneva understood what it meant to honor the woman who'd given her everything. But Geneva wasn't the only family Grandma Celeste had. There was Uncle Terrell, Grandma's youngest son, who'd never quite found his footing in life. Gambling took most of his money, drinking took most of his time, and Grandma's kindness took care of the rest. He lived in Grandma's back room, promising he'd get on his feet, promising he'd help with the business. Promises that evaporated like steam. And then there was Shanice, Terrell's daughter, Geneva's cousin. Shanice was charm personified when she wanted to be, with a smile that could light up a room and a way of making people feel like they were the most important person in the world. The problem was, Shanice never wanted to work for anything. She wanted things to come to her the way rain falls, naturally and without effort. Geneva remembered her college graduation day with a clarity that still stung. She'd been awarded a small scholarship check, money she desperately needed for books and housing. Shanice had offered to deposit it for her since Geneva was rushing between the ceremony and her shift at the campus cafeteria. The check never made it to the bank. When Geneva asked about it, Shanice claimed confusion, said it must have been lost, called it an accident. The money was never repaid. Geneva learned to be more careful after that, but she never stopped loving her cousin. Family was family, and Grandma Celeste always preached forgiveness. The Sunday dinners were harder to forget. Uncle Terrell would sit at the head of the table like he'd earned the spot, drinking beer with his dinner, making comments. Geneva thinks she's better than us with all her books, he'd say, laughing like it was a joke. But his eyes were hard. Too good to stay around here full time. Got to go teach other people's kids instead of helping her own family. Grandma would frown but stay silent, and Geneva would swallow the hurt along with the sweet potato pie. The church picnic, where she'd overheard those women talking, that had been the beginning of the poison. Geneva was carrying a tray of deviled eggs to the serving table when she heard them, two women she'd known for years speaking just loud enough to be heard. Shanice says Geneva don't even visit no more, one of them said, shaking her head. Probably ashamed of us. Gets herself an education and forgets where she came from. Geneva had set down the eggs carefully, her hands shaking, and walked away before they could see her face. But the worst moment, the one that should have told her everything, came 6 months before Grandma died. They were alone in the house. Grandma sitting in her favorite chair, the evening light coming through the window soft and golden. She'd called Geneva over and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was the ruby brooch, the one Grandma's mother had given her, the one that had belonged to her grandmother before that. This goes to the one who loves this family, Grandma Celeste had said, her voice firm despite her age. Not to the one who uses it. She'd looked Geneva straight in the eye when she said it, and Geneva had understood the distinction being made, even if she hadn't wanted to see it. Grandma Celeste died on a Tuesday morning in March. Massive stroke, the doctor said. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. Geneva had been at school teaching a lesson on fractions when she got the call. The world had tilted sideways, and nothing had felt right since. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. Geneva assumed it would be a formality. She knew Grandma had left her the business and the brooch, not because she deserved it more than anyone else, but because Grandma knew she'd honor it, preserve it, keep feeding the neighborhood the way Celeste always had. Geneva had plans. She was going to expand the menu, hire some of the church youth, turn Celeste's table into something even bigger, a legacy worthy of the woman who'd built it. She should have known something was wrong the moment she walked into Deacon Morris's office for the reading. Shanice was already there, dressed in black, eyes red from crying. Uncle Terrell sat beside her, looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't fit quite right. Deacon Morris sat behind his desk with a folder in front of him, his expression somber. "Thank you all for coming," he'd said, opening the folder slowly. "I know this is a difficult time. Celeste Wright was a pillar of this community, and she'll be deeply missed." He pulled out a document, and Geneva noticed it looked new, the paper crisp and white. "This is Sister Celeste's final will and testament, updated and signed shortly before her passing." Geneva had listened, confused at first, then disbelieving, then horrified as Deacon Morris read the provisions. The catering hall, the building, all the equipment, the recipes, everything went to Shanice. The brooch, specifically mentioned, went to Shanice. Geneva was left with personal effects and Grandma's gratitude for her service to the family. Shanice had burst into tears, reaching across the space to hug Geneva. "I can't believe it," she'd sobbed into Geneva's shoulder. Grandma knew who really cared, who was really here for her at the end. Her words were muffled, but Geneva had heard the whisper that came after, meant only for her ears. She knew who really loved her. Geneva had sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. She'd looked at the date on the will, 1 week before Grandma died. But Grandma had been in the hospital that week, unconscious, intubated, dying. Geneva had been there every day after school, sitting beside the bed, holding Grandma's hand. How could Grandma have signed anything? That question was the first crack in the dam. The rest of the flood came quickly after. Geneva had gone to the bank to check on the business account, thinking maybe there was some mistake. Maybe she could at least help Shanice manage things. The account showed a balance of $147. For a business that routinely held thousands, that should have had enough to cover payroll, supplies, and rent for months, this was impossible. She'd requested copies of recent transactions. The checks that had drained the account were all signed Celeste Wright in her grandmother's distinctive handwriting, or at least what looked like her handwriting. But Geneva had seen Grandma's signature thousands of times. She'd watched her sign church bulletins and birthday cards and business documents. And these signatures were wrong. Close, but wrong. The loop on the C was too tight. The flourish on the W didn't quite match. At the county recorder's office, Geneva had pulled up the property deed for Celeste's table. There, recorded 3 weeks before Grandma's death, was a quit-claim deed transferring the property from Celeste Wright to Shanice Davis. The notary seal was pressed so deep into the paper it had almost cut through. The notary's name was Robert Morris, Deacon Morris. Geneva had gone to the church on a Sunday evening, when she knew Deacon Morris would be there, preparing for the week ahead. The rain was hammering on the roof, a spring storm that felt appropriate for the confrontation she was about to have. She'd found him in his office, surrounded by papers, looking every inch the respectable church elder he'd always been. "We need to talk about Grandma's will," Geneva had said, closing the door behind her. Deacon Morris had looked up, his face carefully neutral. "Geneva, I know this must be difficult for you." "She couldn't have signed those documents," Geneva interrupted. "She was in a coma. I was there." "Your grandmother had lucid moments," Deacon Morris said smoothly. "The medical staff can confirm that. She wanted to ensure her affairs were in order. She knew her time was short. You notarized a quit-claim deed. You watched her sign it?" "I did my duty as her spiritual advisor and legal witness." "Celeste wanted Shanice to have the business. She felt that you had your own life, your teaching career. She wanted the business to go to someone who would dedicate themselves to it fully." Geneva had stood there, the rain pounding overhead, the choir starting to practice in the sanctuary above them. Their voices filtered down, a hymn about mercy and grace, and Geneva had wanted to scream at the irony of it. "You're lying," she'd said quietly. Deacon Morris had stood up then, his face hardening. "Your grandmother made her wishes clear. Don't disrespect her memory by challenging them now. She's barely cold in the ground, Geneva. Accept this with grace and move on." The choir had stopped mid-hymn, the sudden silence almost deafening. Geneva had realized they'd heard the confrontation, that they'd stopped to listen. And in that moment, she'd understood how completely alone she was. But she'd found the voicemail. She'd gone back to Grandma's house, technically Shanice's house now, when Shanice was out, using the key she still had. She'd found Grandma's old cell phone in a drawer, the one Grandma had stopped using when her eyesight got bad. Geneva had charged it, hoping for something, anything that might explain what had happened. The voicemail had been there, saved, dated 2 weeks before Grandma's stroke. Shanice's voice, bright and laughing. "Just keep her distracted. The old lady's not going to check the accounts. We'll move it all over before she even notices. Geneva's too soft to fight back. She'll probably just cry and pray about it. Morris is going to sign off on the deed tomorrow, and then it's done. We'll have it all. She'll never know." Geneva had played it 3 times, standing in what used to be her grandmother's bedroom, tears streaming down her face. Here was the proof. Here was the truth. She'd taken the phone straight to Pastor Langston, the head minister of Mount Zion, a man she'd known since childhood, a man who'd baptized her, who'd prayed over her when her parents died. Pastor Langston had listened to the voicemail, his face growing more troubled with each word. When it ended, he'd set the phone down carefully on his desk and looked at Geneva with something that might have been pity. "Geneva," he'd said slowly, "I hear your pain. I understand your confusion, but I have to tell you, the church board has already reviewed this situation." Deacon Morris presented documentation, witness statements. The board voted to support Shanice's claim to the property and business. "But you just heard, I heard a recording that could be about anything. Taken out of context, misunderstood." He'd pause, choosing his words carefully. "The community has concerns, Geneva. People saw how much time you spent away, how you chose your career over helping your grandmother in her final years. Shanice was there. She was present. She earned Celeste's trust." Geneva had felt the world shifting underneath her, the ground turning to quicksand. "That's not true. I sent money. I visited every weekend. I, I'm not saying you didn't care," Pastor Langston had said, his voice gentle in that way that meant the conversation was over. "I'm saying the church has made its decision. Sometimes we have to accept that our perception of events doesn't match how others saw them. I encourage you to seek peace with this, Geneva. Fighting it will only bring more pain." The eviction notice had come 2 days later. As the legal owner of the property, Shanice had the right to determine who lived there. Geneva had 30 days to vacate. She'd spent those 30 days draining her savings account on lawyers who told her the will was legally executed, the deed was properly notarized, and without harder evidence than a voicemail that might not even be admissible, she had no case. The community had turned on her with a swiftness that took her breath away. At the grocery store, women she'd known her entire life would turn their carts around rather than pass her in the aisle. At church, people found seats far away from her. The whisper campaign was relentless. Geneva had abandoned her grandmother for a teaching job. Geneva thought she was too good for her own family. Geneva had stolen from the business and was now lying about it to cover her tracks. And then Shanice had made her final move. She'd gone to Geneva's school, to the principal, to the PTA board, with tearful claims that Geneva had embezzled from PTA funds. The allegations were baseless, completely fabricated, but they were enough. In a school district already struggling with budget issues, already nervous about scandal, Geneva Wright became a liability. They'd put her on administrative leave while they investigated, and then, when no evidence materialized but the rumors wouldn't die, they'd quietly let her go. No charges, no admission of wrongdoing, but no job either. Geneva had moved her belongings into her car, a 15-year-old Honda with a failing transmission. She'd parked at a gas station on the edge of town, one with bathrooms that stayed unlocked at night, and she'd tried to figure out what came next. Her savings were gone, her job was gone, her home was gone, her family had betrayed her community had abandoned her. She had nothing left except the clothes and trash, bags in her back seat, and a faith that was hanging by a thread. It was on her third night sleeping in that car that she saw the old man collapse in the parking lot. It was late, past 11, and Geneva had been trying to sleep when she heard the sound. A heavy thump, like a sack of grain hitting the ground. She'd looked up and seen him lying there under the fluorescent lights, an elderly black man in an expensive suit. His briefcase spilled open beside him. People walked past. A woman with headphones. A man getting gas. No one stopped. Everyone saw, and everyone kept moving, and Geneva understood in that moment that this was what the world had become. This was what happened when everyone decided their own survival mattered more than someone else's suffering. She'd gotten out of her car and run to him. He was breathing but unconscious, his pulse thready and weak. Geneva had pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She had $43 left to her name. The ambulance would cost most of that, maybe all of it. She'd called anyway. While she waited, she'd stayed with him, holding his hand, talking to him even though he couldn't hear. She'd told him he was going to be okay. She'd told him help was coming. She'd prayed, first silently and then out loud, because what else was there to do? When the paramedics arrived, she'd told them everything she'd observed, riding with them to the hospital because he had no one else, staying until they took him back to the emergency room. She never learned his name that night. He'd been unconscious the entire time. Geneva had walked back to the gas station as the sun was coming up, her last dollar spent, her tank nearly empty, and she'd sat in her car and cried until she had nothing left. 3 months later, on a Saturday in June, Shanice hosted a memorial celebration for Grandma Celeste at Celeste's table. The business had been rebranded, modernized, the old warmth replaced with trendy minimalism. Shanice had sent invitations to everyone, a grand celebration of family and legacy, and the entire community had shown up. Deacon Morris gave a speech about honoring the dead through the choices of the living. Shanice wore the ruby brooch pinned to her designer dress and accepted condolences like a queen receiving tribute. Geneva arrived uninvited, parking her battered Honda 3 blocks away because she didn't want anyone to see it. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose, her face gaunt from too many days of not enough food. But she carried a worn file folder under her arm, and she carried something else too. Something that 3 months of suffering hadn't managed to break. She pushed open the door to Celeste's table, and the room went quiet. Every head turned. Shanice's smile froze on her face. Deacon Morris straightened in his chair, his expression hardening. And then the door opened again, and a man walked in behind Geneva. He was older, dignified, wearing a suit that cost more than Geneva used to make in a month. His hair was silver, his bearing confident, and there was something about him that made people pay attention. The room recognized him immediately. Leonard Hayes, retired federal judge, philanthropist, the man who donated the money for the church's new wing. "Good afternoon," Mr. Hayes said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Leonard Hayes, and I'm here because 3 months ago, a young woman saved my life." The room was absolutely silent now. You could have heard a prayer whispered in the parking lot. "I collapsed outside a gas station late one night," Mr. Hayes continued, walking slowly into the room, Geneva beside him. "Heart attack. I was semi-conscious through most of it, but I heard everything. I heard this woman call for help. I heard her spend her last $40 on an ambulance for a complete stranger. I heard her crying while we waited, talking to me even though she thought I couldn't hear, telling me about how she'd been betrayed by her own family, how she'd lost everything, but how she still believed in kindness." Shanice had gone pale. Uncle Terrell was trying to edge toward the door. Deacon Morris sat frozen in his chair. "That woman was Geneva Wright," Mr. Hayes said, looking around the room. "And after I recovered, after I learned who she was and what had happened to her, I hired investigators. What they found was interesting. Very interesting indeed." He nodded to Geneva, who opened her file folder with shaking hands. She pulled out the first document. "The will that left everything to Shanice," Geneva said, her voice stronger than she'd expected, "was forged. The signature was traced from Grandma's old birthday cards. Multiple handwriting analysts confirmed it. More importantly, Grandma Celeste was in a coma on the date this will was supposedly signed. The hospital has records. She was intubated, sedated, dying. She couldn't have signed anything." She pulled out another document. The original will was found hidden in Grandma's Bible at the church. "It leaves everything to me," signed and witnessed 6 months before her death, when she was healthy and sound of mind. Shanice started to speak, but Mr. Hayes held up a hand. "We're not done," Geneva continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "The bank account was drained using forged checks. A forensic accountant traced the money. $87,000 transferred to accounts owned by Shanice Davis and Terrell Wright. The checks were forged using a signature stamp made from Grandma's old checks." She looked at Deacon Morris now. "The quitclaim deed was notarized by Deacon Morris, but the date was falsified. Grandma was never present for that signing, and we have a witness." The back door of the restaurant opened, and Miss Loretta walked in. She was a small woman in her 70s, a church secretary who'd retired 2 years ago. She looked nervous but determined. "I saw them," Miss Loretta said, her voice quavering slightly. "Late one night at the church. Deacon Morris and Shanice in his office, photocopying documents. I saw Grandma Celeste's signature pages spread out on the desk. I asked what they were doing, and Deacon Morris told me it was private church business. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my job, but I kept my calendar. I marked down the date, and I know for certain that Celeste Wright was not in that office that night. She was in the hospital. I visited her myself that evening." The room had erupted into murmurs now, people looking at each other, pieces clicking into place. Mr. Hayes pulled out a small speaker and set it on a table. "Finally," he said, My investigators recovered the voicemail that Geneva found, the one that was deleted from her grandmother's phone. Cloud storage is a wonderful thing. He pressed play and Shanice's voice filled the room, bright and laughing and damning. Just keep her distracted. The old lady's not going to check the accounts. We'll move it all over before she even notices. Geneva's too soft to fight back. She'll probably just cry and pray about it. Morris is going to sign off on the deed tomorrow, and then it's done. We'll have it all. She'll never know. The silence that followed was absolute. Then someone started crying. Then someone else started shouting. The room dissolved into chaos. Shanice was screaming now, standing up, her face twisted. That's fake! They're lying! They made that up! But Uncle Terrell had panicked. He stood up too, backing away, and the words came out before he could stop them. I told you we should have destroyed that phone. I told you! The mask had finally fallen. Shanice whirled on her father, but the damage was done. There was no putting the truth back in the box. Deacon Morris tried to leave, gathering his papers, but Pastor Langston stood and moved to block the door. His face was ashen, but his voice was firm. Sit down, Deacon. We're going to settle this right here, right now, before God in this community. One by one, people started standing. Miss Loretta spoke first, her voice stronger now. I watched Celeste build that business with her own two hands. Shanice never lifted a finger. She never worked a day in that kitchen. Mother Ida stood next, a church mother who'd known Grandma Celeste for 50 years. Geneva sent money home every month. I saw the envelopes myself. I saw that girl sacrifice her own comfort to honor her grandmother. A young woman stood, someone Geneva barely recognized. Brittany, a distant cousin. Shanice paid me $200 to say I saw Geneva steal the brooch. She told me exactly what to say, exactly how to say it. I'm sorry, Geneva. I needed the money, but I shouldn't have lied. The community was correcting course now. The same people who'd shunned Geneva 3 months ago now, turning on Shanice with equal ferocity. The tide had turned, and it was merciless. Mr. Hayes pulled out the final document, a legal injunction bearing multiple signatures and official seals. Here's what happens next, he said calmly. The forged will is voided. The original will is executed. The quit-claim deed is reversed. Shanice Davis and Terrell Wright will repay every cent of the stolen $87,000 with interest or face criminal charges. Deacon Robert Morris's notary license is revoked immediately, and he faces fraud charges pending a criminal investigation. Shanice fell to her knees, the ruby brooch glinting at her throat. She looked up at Geneva, tears streaming down her face. Real tears this time, tears of fear and desperation. Please, she begged. Geneva, please. We're family. You have to forgive me. Grandma would want you to forgive me. The room went silent, everyone waiting to see what Geneva would do. This was the moment. This was where grace or vengeance would be chosen. Geneva looked at her cousin, at the woman who'd destroyed her life, who'd stolen her grandmother's legacy, who'd turned an entire community against her. She thought about Grandma Celeste, about Sunday dinners and forgiveness and grace. She thought about the parking lot, about the old man she'd saved, about choosing kindness when she had nothing left. Grandma taught me forgiveness, Geneva said quietly, but she also taught me justice. You'll repay every cent. You'll face the legal consequences of what you've done, and you'll never use her name again. You'll never claim her legacy as your own. She reached up and unpinned the ruby brooch from Shanice's dress, the metal cold in her palm. This goes to someone who loves family, not someone who uses it. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't celebration, it was catharsis, a community releasing 3 months of guilt and complicity, trying to wash away their own failure with righteous support. The legal process moved swiftly after that. Shanice lost everything, the business, the property, her reputation. She was forced to take a job at a diner across town, working double shifts to make payments on the debt. Uncle Terrell's gambling debts caught up with him, and he left town in the middle of the night, leaving a note saying he was going to stay with family in Atlanta. Deacon Morris resigned from the church in disgrace, and his wife of 30 years filed for divorce. telling anyone who would listen that she'd married a man she thought had integrity. The church board issued a public apology to Geneva in Sunday service, with Pastor Langston reading it from the pulpit, his voice thick with emotion. Half the congregation was crying. The other half should have been. Mr. Hayes funded all of Geneva's legal fees and helped her reopen Celeste's table. The community rallied with donations, volunteers, and tearful apologies that Geneva accepted with grace she didn't entirely feel. Her teaching position was restored with back pay and a written apology from the school board. She wore Grandma's ruby brooch to the grand reopening, and when she unlocked the doors, the line stretched around the block. Mr. Hayes became more than a benefactor. He became a mentor, a silent partner, and eventually something like family. He told Geneva that saving his life had saved his soul too, that he'd been lost in grief after his wife died, that Geneva's kindness had reminded him why any of it mattered. The grand reopening was on a Sunday afternoon in September. The place was packed, the kitchen humming with activity, the smell of Grandma's collard greens filling the air like a benediction. Geneva moved through the crowd, greeting people, accepting hugs, feeling the weight of the brooch against her chest like an anchor and a reminder. The door opened and Shanice walked in. She looked smaller somehow, worn down by months of hard work and harder consequences. The room went quiet again, people watching to see what would happen. Shanice stood there for a long moment, then spoke. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need a job. I can't make my payments otherwise." Geneva looked at her cousin, at the woman who'd once seemed so powerful and was now just broken. She thought about Grandma, about Grace, about the fact that redemption had to be possible, or what was the point of any of it. "You can work here," Geneva said finally. "Minimum wage, washing dishes, same as Grandma started. Maybe you'll learn something." Shanice's face crumbled, but she nodded. She walked toward the back, past all the people she'd once held court over, and disappeared into the kitchen. The crowd erupted in applause again, and this time it was genuine, pure celebration of justice and mercy existing in the same space. That evening, Geneva stood on what was once again her grandmother's porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. She thought about kindness, about the stranger in the parking lot, about the community that had almost destroyed her and then saved her. She thought about how close she'd come to losing everything, including herself. She realized something Grandma Celeste had always known, but Geneva had to learn the hard way. Respect and love aren't inherited. They're earned through action, through sacrifice, through showing up when it costs you something. And sometimes the smallest act of grace, spending your last $40 on a stranger, can move mountains. Sometimes being broken is what cracks you open enough to let the light in. And sometimes the lowest point in your life is just the foundation for everything you're about to build. Geneva touched the ruby brooch pinned over her heart and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma. I finally understand." The sun set over Celeste's table, and the neighborhood came alive with light and laughter, and the smell of food made with love. Some stories end in darkness, but this one finally ended in grace.